No period of church history is more like today than the Protestant Reformation of the early 1500s and the counter-reformation of the mid-1500s. Today we have all the information in the world at our fingertips. Back then, it was the printing press as a commonality in all the regions of Europe and the world of the time that began seeing books of all types printed in mass. People began to become more literate. Before this era, you'd go to your church and they'd have a Bible, handwritten, like this big. It would be chained to the dais, and if you wanted to know what it said, you'd have to ask the priest. Imagine a time where all of a sudden you live in Western Europe, but you can read the Bhagavad Gita about the religions of the East. Imagine a time where all of a sudden, a period post-crusade, you can read the very holy book of the people that you fought against for so many centuries. You can even read the Talmud from the Jewish people. This sparked a lot of questions. It sparked a great period of enlightenment. That period of enlightenment was known as the Italian Renaissance. It affected Rome greatly, where the Pope lived at the time. They had all the money, all the power. You had famous popes like Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, and his treasurer, who would become Pope Paul III, Alessandro Farnese, who as a young man had been governor of papal states. He held every papal administrative office, had been treasurer. Not all the time a guy of good character, but if you want somebody to run the counter-reformation after the Reformation destroys the Catholic Church and leaves only Spain and Italy decidedly Catholic, you might want this guy. The period is so significant that it is the subject matter of The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli, who's trying to understand power, how it's wielded, how it's used. Is it better to be respected or loved? Is it better to be feared or respected? He found his answers during this period of great names like de' Medici, Piccolomini, della Rovere, Sforza, Farnese, Borgia, all in the College of Cardinals together at the same time. After the Reformation, and during it for that matter, the Counter-Reformation begins in the late 1530s, early 1540s, during the papacy of Paul III. In fact, Martin Luther would die within the first year or two of the Counter-Reformation. He jokingly writes, you can kind of guess that he thought he seriously was going to be invited to this Councils of Trent to present the Protestant side. Why would he think that? Because it's only later historians that make him a separate dude, totally in protest of the Catholic Church. He was a devoted priest for much of his life. And I have a surprise for you at the end that's going to blow your mind. Now, on to the Councils of Trent and our boy back here, Paul III. Have you ever heard of the Catechism of the Catholic Church? Most of us have, but if you're Protestant, you never read it, because the two things we know as Protestants in America are Catholic bad and anything but Bible bad. Well, this is the Catechism of the Catholic Church. This particular one is special for the United States, deals with the particular culture of the United States. This one here is the World Catechism, deals with the entire world. It comes from, guess what? The Council of Trent. In fact, the Council of Trent had multiple sessions over 18 years, beginning with Paul III, but Pius IV was also in there, and one other pope. I can't recall his name off the top of my head. Julius III was the other one. But anyway, here they are, the Catechisms of the Council of Trent, because they're good honest effort to try to improve the situation was to say, well, look, we have to put what we believe in the hands of our priests so that they can properly educate people about the Christian faith. This really matters. It's important. This Reformation showed us that, when politics and religion get all mixed up, these rising nation states in Europe with their flags and their borders and their economies and their power kicking out archbishops and cardinals from their courts, leaving us in shambles, we need to go back to our roots. We need to go back to our apostolic roots. So they lay out this catechism, or I should say the catechism today is laid out like this. It's 4 main sections. The first section is based on the Nicene Creed. We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. And it's a huge section. And it lays out the faith as believed. It makes statements of fact without coming to doctrinal conclusions. It's an interesting document. Section 2 is celebration of the Christian mysteries. It talks about the sacraments. In the Catholic faith, there are 7 of them. You have sacraments of initiation, sacraments of healing, and you have holy orders. In short, your initiation sacraments are like baptism, the first time you take communion, and confirmation, or you reach the age of culpability and decide you're going to be in the church. You also have sacraments of healing, confession, reconciliation, and healing the sick. And then you have holy orders, which is like, becoming a priest or marriage. The third section is life in Christ, and it breaks down the 10 commandments and talks about, again, making statements of fact by numbered articles from 1 all the way up into the 2000s. And the fourth section deals specifically with prayer. It gets real deep into prayer and how to use it. It was inspired by voluminous writings that had been done by Martin Luther teaching people about the faith. His small called articles are kind of like a nice small book that give you a basic gist, but he was a voluminous writer. He wrote a lot of stuff. And this is the posture of the good part of this fight. Let's talk about what Christians believe, get back to our roots. We always spend time talking about councils at Nicaea, Ephesus, Constantinople, but these councils of Trent were aiming to do just that, to restore the integrity of the church as the timeless institution that it was. On the other hand, that's why it might be good to have a guy like this in your corner. He also oversaw the formation of what were called the Jesuits. It was a military religious order devoted by vow specifically to the Pope. A lot of the conspiracies you hear about them, they're kind of true. That was their job, though. They would specialize in some life skill and then take religious vows. One of them was devotion to the Pope. And you think, how does some sick maniacal mind come up with an idea of a person who as a front has a religious order, but is really doing all these militant, subversive things? Well, first of all, it's not like that. Secondly, there was a precedent. What were the Crusades but military monastic orders like the Templars, who on one hand had unique religious devotions, on the other, Deus Vult, God wills it. Let's go and kill Saracens and Mohammedans in Turkey and in the Holy Land. So it was simply a progression of that type of thinking. Well, Paul III would pass away, and Pius IV would take over the second set of sessions. Julius III would oversee it. And at the end, the catechism would be made for everybody. And it became a very popular document. It still is today. Back then, when it was first out, it was pretty uncommon for the average person to read the catechism, but now it's all the time. If you're going to become a Catholic as an adult, you go through RCIA and you spend your time in the catechism reading what it has to say. And as you go through the various sacraments, you're pointed to the sections that it speaks about. Here's something very interesting that you should know about, though. I'm holding in my hand what's called the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification. The Catholic Church and the Lutheran World Foundation over a number of years formed a study group, and they got together looking specifically at Martin Luther's doctrine on justification. And their conclusion was that Martin Luther was right. We've got no beef. We believe the same things about justification. What Martin Luther did, though, was he wrote a complete doctrine about justification. Whereas the catechism made statements of fact about the faith, Martin Luther began the precedent that Protestant denominations and later confessional faiths would follow to write clear, specific, detailed, beginning to end doctrines. Well, there's pluses and minuses to that. They're clear, they're thorough, in many cases they're true, but you also have secondary doctrines that have nothing to do with salvation, that lead to subtle disagreements, to where you end up with three of the exact same denomination having a church all within a 1 mile radius. It's as if the decadence and the over-excess and the abuse of power and privilege that the church enjoyed for so many generations, they enjoyed the authority over multi-generational institutional faith. Fathers to sons, to mothers, to daughters, generation after generation. It's almost as if God scattered his people, just like he did in the Old Testament to the Jews of old. And the Reformation and counter-reformation for the last 500 years has been our time in the wilderness. It really has. And it's unfortunate because it's like the truth is a bag of marbles in God's hand. And now they've been spilled out everywhere with little groups everywhere holding pieces of the truth. The good news is it's really no different from the beginning. There were Christian sects from day one. What are you talking about, Nick? The Bible says that avoid sectarian behavior. Paul, Peter, they all talked against sectarian behavior. That's right, they did. Even the early church fathers did. But we misunderstand what that means because we have a view in our mind that the early church only ever had one view. They were perfect and whole, and only over time did they get split. But no, that's not what they're saying in the Bible when they say avoid sectarian behavior, or when the early church fathers say it. There's unbelievers, there's Christian sects who all have slightly different ideas about what things mean, and then there are Christians, those who get it, who God calls and are called out of all these things. And it's no different today. You find true believers across the spectrum in almost every sect. So I hope this has been informative and explains why I have a portrait 500 years after the fact of one of the most controversial figures in church history. He's not that much more controversial, though, than that one, is he? Martin Luther back there. They both had strengths and weaknesses. And we have to remember when we're studying church history that they were humans. These are human-run institutions. And the weight on them, wow. They're human-run institutions that are trying to answer some of the deepest questions about existential, divine questions. Who are we? Why are we here? Is something wrong with the world? How can it be made right? So we owe it to each other and to ourselves to push ourselves more and more in this information age, just like they did in the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, to learn as much as we can and to try to be objective, to see all sides of it. Because at the end, it's only going to deepen our faith and give us greater tools with which to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is the ultimate truth. If you'd like to help me take my church ministry, my church history ministry, in public, which is something I'm raising to do right now, you can help. In the video description, you'll find links to PayPal, Cashapp, Venmo. You can click thanks here. If you happen to follow me on the other platforms, there's other ways to give there too. I'll be using the money to purchase the material I need for performances of church history in front of congregations to get them interested so that I can bring them into the classroom. I'm going to need a lot more portraits than just Paul III to pull this off. But I know with your support I can do it. So please help. God bless you, and may your work today bear fruit. Thanks.